Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's one of the best events of the year, I think. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm the interim president of the Graduate Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our second annual Graduate Center Dissertation Showcase. And I want to extend a special welcome tonight to Deputy Borough President Aldrin Bonilla and to James Meiskens, who was recently appointed, as I'm sure you all have heard, as the Graduate Center's next interim president. So thanks to both of you for coming tonight. We're happy to have you. Tonight, 17 doctoral and master's students have the chance to demonstrate with extreme speed, as you will see, although hopefully not speed of uttering words, but with concision and brilliance. They're going to demonstrate to you very quickly the thorough, original, and well-documented work that they've been doing over the last few years. So now all of you, and especially family and friends, are going to have the chance to see or to find out why you don't actually see your loved one. You don't see them enough, I'm sure. You're going to hear why in some detail, but again, with concision. These students represent the more than 3,700 doctoral and master's students whose scholarship is at the heart of what we do at the Graduate Center. We're the home of groundbreaking and award-winning research in the sciences and the social sciences and the humanities and the arts. And we're also a community, and this is why this is really one of my favorite events of the year. We're a community that shares a commitment to outstanding research and scholarship to promote the public good that's publicly accessible. Our faculty aim to inspire students to build careers that allow them to make their mark as great scholars, as great scientists, great teachers, great artists in technology, but also the private sector and in public service, inside and outside academia, really wherever their careers might take them. We believe and act out every day, I hope, that a great graduate education prepares students for all manner of lives inside and outside the academy. And we know that our graduates have a lot to offer the world inside and outside the academy because they're ready, as you're about to hear, to tackle some of the world's biggest challenges and wickedest problems. Tonight's presenters come from disciplines across our doctoral programs, from theater to chemistry to earth and environmental science to urban education. They've spent precious time pipetting in labs and searching through archives and many other such methods and techniques. They've analyzed data, they've transcribed notes, they've done a million interviews, they have edited their prose, their deathless prose, they've edited and re-edited and re-edited. And many of them have already defended their theses in front of their committees. And after all that, it's very exciting and heartening to know that they had enough left in them to stand up and take our challenge to distill it all into about 3 minutes that will offer all of us a view into their important research. I should add that tonight's presenters, so you understand the process, voluntarily, they did this voluntarily, they submitted applications and they were selected by a panel of judges for this showcase. I should say I'm a classicist, so I can't resist quoting a famous a quote by a scholar in ancient Alexandria in Egypt who famously said, mega biblion, mega kakon, which is Greek for big book, big bad. And his argument was, keep it short. We all know also the phrase, if I'd had more time, I would have made it shorter. Right? So we all know how much work it is to distill, to encapsulate complex thinking, complex arguments with many, many sources, often questions with long histories behind them, into a brief abstract. But this is the challenge, and I know our students are more than up to it. So I want to thank tonight's intrepid presenters, who must be gearing up for their moment right now, and their dedicated advisors. I want to especially thank the organizers of tonight. I know Karen Sander and Duncan Faherty have worked especially hard to get this event up and running. It's with enormous pride that we showcase for you the extraordinary work of our doctoral students. I have to add, too, that I asked Karen and Duncan a few minutes ago, who is keeping time? And they looked at me disdainfully and said, our students are way beyond that. So put away your watches, no need for you to keep time, and please help me welcome our first presenter from the Department of Comparative Literature, Ashna Ali. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm an immigrant. For most people who identify as immigrants, listening to the news these days is scary. I live in New York, but I grew up in Italy as a Bangladeshi immigrant. The kinds of discrimination I experience in Italy and in the US are very different, but they come from the same historical ideologies about outsiders. Watching the global north close its doors while so many seek to escape war, persecution, and environmental disaster caused by Western capitalism makes me sick. Listening to narratives that make migrants out to be terrorists, subjects of pity, or people who need to be humanized makes me sicker. It has become clear that we use the parameters of citizenship, a right first developed in the interests of cis, heterosexual, land-owning, middle-class white men, to measure people's humanity. Those without representation by a state are rendered less than human, and mainstream narratives require that they expose their vulnerability to us so we might see them as human enough for our support. This begs the question, where are the migrant stories that we're not hearing? I started looking for narratives that represent the violence of migrant dehumanization. I found that most well-known literatures of movement features stories of privileged crossing, in which subjects have passports, travel by plane, and have little trouble getting their voices heard. Then I came across the poetry of Shailja Patel, pictured top left. Patel is a Kenyan migrant of Indian descent, whose family experienced exile and migration from India to Kenya to Britain to the US. Patel's poetry isn't just about the suffering of migration. Her work is angry and unafraid to hold heteropatriarchy, racism, and colonialism accountable for creating the oppression of migrants in the present. She coined the term migritude, which is also the title of her book. She defines migritude as migrants with attitude, or a generation of migrants who don't feel the need to be silent in order to protect themselves. My dissertation studies migritude literature, or narratives written by or about this generation of migrants, an explicitly feminist activist literature that is unapologetic about tracing the connections between 18th and 19th century European colonial projects and present-day global North border regimes. This literature takes a stand for migrant dignity. I studied narratives written by women of color in English and in Italian, and placed them together to see what they have in common and whether they can be argued to be a genre of their own. The resulting study shows how migrant literature can tell more complete, honest, and nuanced stories about what it really means to live as a migrant woman contending with forced labor. In addition to Shailja Patel, I analyzed the work of African-American scholar of Atlantic slavery, Saidiya Hartman, pictured top center, Indo-Caribbean scholar of indenture, Gayatri Bahadur, pictured bottom left, and two Somali-Italian authors concerned with the Mediterranean refugee experience, Cristina Lifarà, top right, and Ijaba Shego, bottom left. Despite how far-flung their work is in time period, geography, and political context, it all addresses the importance of knowing the world through intuition and emotion, whereas Western Enlightenment ideas of reason and objectivity operate to discount the experience of colonized and female subjects. Migritude literature describes experiences of fragmentation, cultural confusion, forced labor, slavery, indenture, Islamophobia, and neo-fascist violence to make connections between colonial histories and neo-imperial presence that we do not hear in mainstream media. My hope is that the more we listen to stories that assert migrant dignity, the better we can work together against these violences and create a just world for migrants. Thank you.
Instead of processing your thoughts and feelings about a stressful event such as a fight with a loved one, have you ever ended up filling your day? You went out for a run, you cleaned out your closet, you Netflixed an entire series. You're not alone in responding that way. It's just the context that changes. What if the context was advanced cancer and memento mori, this idea of facing your own mortality? In 2018 alone, over 500,000 people died from cancer in the United States, presumably contending with their mortality. Rather than doling out more stats, I instead want to share a story about TJ, a man with advanced cancer. TJ feels supported by his family and friends. He's receiving care at a quality cancer center. He trusts his oncologist. A recent conversation with said oncologist went something like this. We can't exactly predict how effective treatment will be, and the prognosis, how long you have TJ, is uncertain. It could be 6 months, it could be a year, and it could be longer. Now, TJ had always been organized, but after his cancer progressed and many such conversations with his trusted oncologist, he became a to-do list pundit. Every week, he took on a new home project, whether it was painting, cleaning, or small repairs. To the outside eye, he seemed to be doing okay, all things considered. But TJ was not okay. He was dealing with anxiety, sadness, and even anticipatory grief. But rather than process what was going on internally, TJ was doing something we psychologists call experiential avoidance. Normally when you think avoidance, you think about it as someone holed up in their room, physically not doing anything. And that can and does happen. Experiential avoidance is when you try to avoid what you're thinking, feeling, imagining, experiencing inside. And it may work in the short term, but think about how exhausting it would be trying to constantly escape what's going on inside, because in a sense, that's like trying to escape from yourself. That is what my research with 108 advanced cancer patients suggests. Those who found the idea of uncertainty or the unknown unbearable were more likely to experientially avoid, like TJ, which paradoxically was related to more rather than less symptoms of depression and anxiety. This process occurred even when patients felt supported by their family and friends, and even when they reported a lot of trust in their physician. So as I move into clinical internship year, where I will conduct therapy with individuals who have chronic illness, are facing considerable situational uncertainty, and potentially the prospect of shortened life, I would take this approach into the room with me. The pain is there. When you close one door on it, it's just a matter of time before it knocks to come in somewhere else, like an uninvited but persistent guest. So let's choose to face it, and let's face it together. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. So who here has a smartphone? Who here has a laptop? Who here has thought about how much carbon dioxide you emit by sending an email? How much energy it takes to connect to the internet? We're all mostly aware that energy consumption is important. But have you thought about how our devices use and waste energy? For example, the familiar heating up of a laptop occurs because for every process, some percentage of the energy used is dissipated, or in other words, just wasted. Why is that? It's because of the components of electronics. As you can see in the top center and right, they take up a large amount of space. They're densely packed, like us on the subway in the morning. The result of this is the sum of dissipation from each component, which you may now understand is substantial. Therefore, device development focused on energy consumption efficiency has much room for improvement. If one can reduce the space taken by these components, this will not only reduce the overall dissipation, but allow for different components to take their place. And so the improvement is twofold. You can reduce the energy wasted, and you can also put more components dedicated to device performance. Many years ago, when I started the Ph.D. program, I had to ask myself, how will I reduce the volume of these components, and how will I do that with not at the cost of device performance? I took inspiration from everyday life. On a hot summer day, after watching an episode of Arrested Development, I wanted to treat myself to an ice cream sandwich. I asked myself, why do they put ice cream in a sandwich? Why a sandwich? To make one, you must combine things so that they complement each other. What do you do if you have ice cream and no bowl? Well, you can eat it, but it will come at the expense of some ice cream wasted, as you can see on the bottom left. But if you can contain it, it doesn't lead to as much waste. As long as you don't procrastinate, you might just finish it without wasting anything. So the orientation and order matters as well. You wouldn't want to put the ice cream around the cookies, right? So after that, after finishing my sandwich, I ran to lab. I was inspired to make my own sandwich. For my research approach, I used chemistry to make particles thousands of times smaller than a grain of sand. Instead of putting them between two cookies, I put them between two metal electrodes, which conduct electricity. As you can see on the bottom right, the metal sandwiches are so thin you can't even see the filler ice cream with the naked eye. In this configuration, my components dissipate even less energy than commercially available components, have 10 times less volume, and they're still able to perform the functions that they were made for. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Milt Attensasser. My dissertation is in the field of political science, international relations. How many of you have thought about the role of interest groups in domestic politics? How many of you have thought about the impact of interest groups in foreign policy? My dissertation takes this up, the second, much less controversial phenomenon. My research explored how non-state actors, interest groups which are separate and apart from any particular nation or nations, have worked to shape the formation of international law. I sought to analyze this by focusing on a case study on an environmental treaty negotiated in 1969 at Brussels under the auspices of a United Nations specialized agency, the Intergovernmental Maritime Consultative Organization, which is a mouthful, IMCO for short. The resultant treaty established financial liability for ships and ultimately for the petroleum companies for damage resulting from oil spills. The treaty, as originally written, provided for compensation of up to $14 million per incident. This number has multiplied over the last 50 years and today stands in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and it remains the benchmark treaty, the gold standard in terms of financial compensation to those damaged by environmental catastrophes. I found that the negotiating process was characterized by intense bargaining among states, as well as IMCO, and most importantly, special interest groups or non-state actors in the establishment of this international regime. The non-state actors who played prominent roles were shipping interests, insurance companies, which insured the oil tankers, and international oil companies, all of whom attempted to secure their sectoral interests during the negotiating process. Further, individuals who held leadership positions at the conference also had private professional relationships which overlapped with their official roles within IMCO, as well as with their leadership of national delegations. These interactions are examined through concepts in interest group theory as developed by political scientists, especially regulatory capture, which describes the phenomenon by which a legislature or bureaucracy becomes captured by the very interest that it seeks to regulate. By way of example, up there, Dr. Albert Lilar, who was the main player at the Brussels conference, was professionally involved with the shipping industry and its main interest group, the CMI, yet also officially ran the conference on behalf of IMCO and simultaneously led the Belgian delegation. The net result of intense negotiations at Brussels was that the system agreed to established a two-tier level of compensation with an initial amount provided by the shipping industry and the insurance companies, and a secondary, larger tier to be paid by the oil industry. This plan made the objectives of the shipping and insurance industries. I discovered this through a series of interviews with those who participate in the process, as well as by connecting the dots in the existing literature which dealt with the legal ramifications of the decisions made at Brussels rather than the decision-making process itself. Finally, I believe that my dissertation, which, by the way, is being published by NYU Law School, by analyzing that which occurred 30 years ago at Brussels, will lead to better understanding of what is required in contemporary efforts to deal with the environment, such as the Paris Accords. I was told I could speak about myself for 1 minute. I began the program in 1966. I began my dissertation in 1969. I realized that to understand this, I needed to take some courses in law school. I got a law degree. I've been a practicing attorney for many years. For 2.5 years ago, I said, time to finish. And last year, I was on leave for 46 years. Last year, I re-entered the program 2.5 years ago, and I defended my thesis last year. Thank you.
Good evening. I took this photograph on August 31st, 2017, in Worcester, Massachusetts, on International Overdose Awareness Day, a public event held around the world, but in this case, in front of City Hall in Worcester. The photo shows the memorial wall, the faces of the opioid crisis. If this memorial were to display all the people who've died to overdose in the United States since the year 2000, it would show over 200,000 faces. American sociologist C. Wright Mills once wrote that sociology allows us to understand when personal troubles are actually public issues of broad societal importance. In many ways, this photograph shows just that. A personal trouble, now a public issue, as people come together around the memory of loved ones to grieve in a public space. For my dissertation, Grief, Care, and Politics in the American Opioid Crisis, I was interested in how the loss of people to the opioid crisis impacts politics and social life, in particular, the role of grief. So, what are the social and political implications of grief? I argue that grief serves a unique role in creating discourses and experiences of healing, victimhood, and blame. Most importantly, grief is a politically significant social process that brings people together around common private experiences in new, transformative ways. To complete the research, I focused on New England, a region with one of the highest overdose rates in the country. I interviewed 60 people, half of whom from relevant professions related to the opioid crisis: social workers, doctors, public health officials, and local politicians, and the other half, ordinary people who lost a loved one to drug overdose. I spent time in community settings, attending over 25 public gatherings and events, grief groups and advocacy meetings, public rallies, memorials and vigils, along with the analysis of relevant documents and reports. Although the case study focuses on New England, it's situated in broader perspective, stressing connections to the war on drugs and the Mexican drug war through fieldwork in Mexico, a country who's paid their own price for the current regional drug policy through the Mexican drug war and the militarization of Mexican society. In the New England case study, I find what I term communities of care. Communities of care, often formed in response to healthcare shortages and inconsistencies, are online and in-person spaces where people share emotional and practical support related to opioid addiction and overdose. I find that over time, these spaces become politicized as shared frustrations mount and emphasis shifts to explicit political action. For example, in the protests organized by grieving mothers in front of Purdue Pharma, maker of famed OxyContin in Stamford, Connecticut last summer. As such, grief should be understood as an opportunity for unique solidarities, what I term shared grief, allowing for alliances between those impacted by the opioid crisis, the carceral state, and for our southern neighbors, the militarization of Mexican society. Finally, this study opens up new directions in political sociology, political theory, the study of the life course, and death and dying, by showing how the death of a loved one and the social process of grief can be both identity-altering and a political catalyst. As I find people move from the isolating pain of grief, complicated by drug overdose, to politicized communities of care, demanding and creating change. Thank you.
Al Jolson singing Mammy in blackface, Mickey Rooney's yellowface performance as Mr. Yunioshi in the 1961 film Breakfast at Tiffany's, Trump's repeated labeling of Mexicans as drug lords and sexual predators. I imagine all these representations of blackness, Asianness, and Mexicanness are familiar to most of us here, as they have long been documented in U.S. history in general and in U.S. popular culture in particular. But what about Lee Tung-Fu, the Chinese-American vaudeville singer and comedian who performed novelty songs in a Scottish brogue and wearing a Scottish kilt? Or Chinese-American Charlie Lowe's all-Chinese South American review that taught white audiences how to conga? Or African-American clown Harry Fiddler, whose yellow-faced Chinese impersonations caused a sensation in vaudeville and early musical comedies? Then there's the chorus line of the Mexican-American Carpa Cubana troupe, who performed the African-American cakewalk costumed in plantation gingham. I expect most of us here have never heard the names I've mentioned in the latter group. You are forgiven. This is likely due to the fact that even though historians agree that the practice of comedic racial and class impersonations in early 20th century musical variety is an all-American practice, their use of the term all-American almost always means white. As a result, the scholarly discourse has largely remained segregated, as most studies typically focus on a single stereotype, such as blackface, yellowface, and brownface, and almost never whiteface, performed by either white comedians or comedians of the so-called same color being impersonated. Indeed, one historian shockingly claimed, as recently as 2014, that American musical comedy is a major cultural white art form that firmly reflects a white outlook on American life. This approach maintains whiteness at the center of the field and the others on its periphery, implicitly bolstering the notion that musical comedy is the privileged purview of white clowns. This is, of course, musical comedy nonsense. And I show in my dissertation that there is a much richer and more complex history of racial and class impersonations in the United States than has yet been studied. Through extensive archival research, I illuminate the contributions those African, Asian, and Mexican-American musical comedy clowns have made to this all-American form. I explore the types they performed on tour throughout the United States on their own self-managed circuits from the late 19th century through the mid-20th. All three circuits regularly featured comedic performances of those colored faces mentioned previously, and always included white faces. My dissertation also considers the roles these comedians played offstage in the public sphere, as theater managers, booking agents, and as citizens moving throughout areas that were often hostile to their presence, effectively integrating some parts of the country. This is especially significant given that these tours were prior to the civil rights movement and during times of legislation specifically challenging the citizenship and right to be present of all three populations under consideration. Ultimately, I argue that at the same time these African, Asian, and Mexican-American clowns defined their own U.S. Americanness through these racial and ethnic impersonations, they also did so through their performances of show business savvy offstage, and productively redefined what it means to be an American. Considering all three circuits in a single study, I show that the all-American practice of racial and ethnic ridicule in the name of musical comedy is not, and never has been, a white privilege, and pose the question, who else has been overlooked or ignored in U.S. popular cultural history? Thank you.
Good evening. I would like you to think about the last time you heard the words mental health or mental illness mentioned in a conversation or in the media. For most of you, you probably heard these words mentioned in a negative light. Oftentimes, we just hear the negative stories about mental health, not the stories of recovery or accomplishment, which would be more accurate and humanizing representations of people living with mental illness. Unfortunately, many people worldwide still endorse negative stereotypes or beliefs about mental health, including incorrectly believing that people with mental illness are disproportionately violent or cannot ever recover, which are untrue. These stereotypes can deter help seeking, but can also prevent full inclusion into society. And stigma is what we call this process of assigning labels to people, endorsing stereotypes, and or engaging in discrimination. In thinking about how to fight this stigma, I decided to focus on youth for my project. Adolescence is an important developmental period, and I think a key time to interrupt the stigma process. It is a time when emerging attitudes and identities are first forming, Additionally, 50% of lifetime mental health conditions begin by age 14. We also know that only about 35% of adolescents with mental illness actually receive treatment, and that percentage is even lower for ethnic and racial minority youth. For my dissertation, I partnered with a public New York City high school, as well as a local affiliate of a national nonprofit organization called NAMI, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I tested the effectiveness of their intervention called Ending the Silence. So Ending the Silence is a short program. It's a one class period presentation designed to reduce stigma and increase mental health knowledge. It covers mental health education and importantly includes an in-person story from a young adult living with mental illness who shares their journey of recovery. I recruited 206 high school students for this study and randomly assigned classrooms to see either Ending the Silence or an active control presentation. And I surveyed students 4 times, before the presentations, immediately after, 1 month later, and 2 months later. Our results were promising, as you can see here. Compared to the control group, students who saw Ending the Silence showed reduced negative stereotypes. Students who saw Ending the Silence also showed improved mental health knowledge. Not shown here, but we also saw trends for students who saw Ending the Silence to have more positive feelings towards people with mental illness, and also more personal intentions to seek counseling for themselves. And these effects were typically strongest right after seeing the presentation. So overall, a short presentation that combined education with contact, so hearing a positive, realistic, humanizing story about mental illness, appeared to have a positive effect for youth. We do know ultimately improving mental health, especially youth mental health, requires a multifaceted effort, so targeting other social determinants of health, developing youth-led stigma reduction and health promotion programming, and also improving access across the board to evidence-based care, especially for minority communities. Thank you.
I want to talk about love. In particular, I want to talk about love stories. Which ones end in happily ever after, and which ones conclude in despair. Previous literary scholarships suggested that if you want a happy ending, passion has to take a backseat to long-term commitment. We can see this in many popular romances. There, the characters start the book either deeply infatuated with one another or just unable to stand each other. But by the end of the book, that passion's been corralled, and instead they're so clearly committed that there's no doubt that their love will continue after the final page. At the same time, we also have books like Madame Bovary. There we can watch as characters, often female ones, follow their passion straight to the grave. But I suggest there's actually a second form of the love story. This one has endings that are governed by mutual and accurate enough recognition. To do this, you have to acknowledge your loved one's agency and complexity. You also have to understand them in a way that's close enough to how they see themselves to be acceptable to them. On the other hand, more despairing narrative outcomes are tied to what I call false recognition. This is the deliberate and repeated use of inaccurate recognition to create fictions about identity and relationship. For an example of this, we can look to Lolita. There, Humbert would have you believe he's telling us a love story, but in it, he refuses to acknowledge who 12-year-old Dolores truly is in an attempt to justify his sexual attraction to her. By the end of the book, he's in prison, and pretty much everyone else has died. And while Lolita is a particularly egregious example, many books that use false recognition do indeed end like this, in madness, serious injury, exile, or death. Once we know to look for this plot, we can see it all over the place. It, too, is in popular romances. You can think of The Notebook. There, Allie's discovery that Noah wrote her all those letters enables her to understand who he truly is, and it's at that point that they can spend the rest of their lives with one another. It's also in narratives from a very long time ago. Aristophanes' myth from 370 BC shows Zeus creating sex in order to save the soulmates who've recognized one another, something you might call a consummate happy ending. My dissertation asks why we're seeing this form of the love story. I perform about 20 close readings of films and novels, which are both canonical and popular, and which represent a much larger number of films and novels that I read. I use a framework that mingles literary scholarship, psychoanalytic scholarship, philosophy, and history. And ultimately, I suggest we're seeing this form of the love story for many of the same reasons why it's important to think about it. It acknowledges our changing ideas about love, passion, and relationship. Just think, marriage was once primarily a social contract that tied you to society. And passion was thought to be something that came upon you suddenly and made you act unlike yourself before disappearing as quickly as it came. Now, many Americans marry for love, and people often wonder if something's wrong with their relationship if they're no longer passionate about their partner. Love stories can reflect these questions and ideals, and that's worth acknowledging. So it's with this in mind that I hope you each strive to examine your own love stories, and that you work very hard to accurately recognize yourself and the people you love. Because after all, literature shows the alternative can be very lonely. Thank you.
When I was 8 years old, I loved to play with dirt in a garden in southern Russia. I crushed soils, rocks, bricks, squeezed juice from grasses, and even frogs sometimes, and mix them all together to get different colors and textures. 12 years later, when I came to the United States, I was really shocked to see gardens in the middle of the city. Because in Russia, people garden in their backyards, and it's hidden, while here, urban gardening is a public activity. Later, working at the Soul Lab at Brooklyn College, I learned about the benefits of urban gardening, like community building, grocery bill reduction, and fresh produce, and also about potential hazards associated with legacy contamination. Growing up in a pollution-free zone, I was really excited to study soil contamination in New York City soils and vegetables. I have been solving problems of actual people having real soil contamination issues that were even featured in newspapers. My research addresses lead and arsenic contamination, which is common in urban soils and is a major challenge for urban gardening. Soil contamination has not received enough attention in media and public, and it requires more research, more awareness, and more public education. I conducted both field work in community gardens and laboratory analysis at Brooklyn College. It was a truly collaborative effort of scientists, students, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations. In New York City, we have observed very high lead concentrations in a wide range of neighborhoods in northern Brooklyn that require attention and remediation to reduce human exposure. This map confirms that soil contamination is widespread and highly variable, complicating approaches for education and remediation. Our results show that contamination is beyond urban boundaries and commonly found in suburban soils, formerly sprayed by lead, arsenate, pesticides. Contaminated soils can potentially produce contaminated crops, which further can be consumed by people. Most of the risks come from soil particles stuck to the vegetable surfaces. Plants do not take much of metals into their tissues. Our studies show that the root vegetables such as carrots and radishes and leafy greens such as lettuce and kales contain lead and arsenic way more than fruit vegetables. Tomatoes were the safest vegetables for consumption. Soil amendments used to remediate contaminated soils may not work as expected. So far, building raised beds with a clean soil and adding compost show the best results. The choice of crops really matters. Choose fruits over roots if you plant in contaminated gardens. And remember, Soils can be quite contaminated in New York City, causing potential health risks. Be aware of potential legacy contamination in your urban garden. Thank you.
Stereotypes linking immigrants with crime have a long history in the United States. Despite a large body of research proving that these links are baseless, claims of immigrant criminality continue to shape policy today. This trope is hyper-visible in the current president's calls for increasingly punitive and exclusionary immigration policy based on claims that immigrants are bringing drugs, bringing crime, and are rapists. However, it is also visible in liberal proposals for immigration reform that call for the amnesty of immigrants deemed deserving, family, children, students, by contrasting them to those deemed undeserving, immigrants with criminal records. For example, Obama's focus on deporting felons, not families. This false dichotomy between good and bad immigrants not only relies on the idea that those deemed criminal could not possibly have positive ties to their families and communities, but it also combines all immigrants with any type of criminal history into one monolithic category: criminal aliens who are deserving of deportation. With immigrant criminality on the forefront of the national conversation and the deportation of so-called criminal aliens framed as a top political priority, there is a need for critical research that seeks to better understand affected populations and the legal basis for their removal. With an aim towards filling this gap, my dissertation explores the development of the aggravated felony, an expansive category of crimes that has triggered the deportation of hundreds of thousands of immigrants, including many green card-holding lawful permanent residents over the past 30 years. Crimes in this category need not be aggravated nor felonies, but rather include a broad range of criminal convictions, including misdemeanors, ranging from check fraud and simple drug possession to drug trafficking and murder. Immigrants convicted of aggravated felonies are subject to mandatory detention and almost certain deportation, as they are ineligible for almost all forms of legal relief from removal. Furthermore, due to the administrative or civil status of immigration law, immigrants convicted of aggravated felonies are not guaranteed lawyers and can be detained indefinitely without bond. I examined the outcomes of the aggravated felony through a case study of New York City, an increasing focus of the Trump deportation regime and the only city in the country to provide universal legal representation to detained immigrants facing deportation. Based on a year of ethnographic court observation, 39 interviews with lawyers and advocates, and analyses of archival data, findings demonstrate how immigration law processes work to doubly punish groups already disproportionately targeted by the criminal justice system, reproducing existing inequalities through the enforcement of the good immigrant, bad immigrant binary. However, this research also revealed creative forms of legal resistance that have emerged under the city's unique model of universal representation, a system under which 48% of detained immigrants win relief from deportation, as compared to 4% of similar unrepresented cases. Therefore, findings suggest key implications for advocates and legislators concerned with creating equal systems of justice and protecting the rights of immigrants nationwide. In addition to an urgent need for significant and simultaneous reforms of our criminal justice and immigration systems, this research emphasizes the vital role of increased legal representation for immigrants with criminal records, as well as the importance of advocacy and scholarship that works to disrupt the oversimplified dichotomy between good and bad immigrants. Thank you.
Hello. Communication is the cornerstone of humanity. We communicate in every aspect of our lives, face-to-face or through texts, phone calls, and a slew of other mediums. Even this event tonight is really just a showcase of our ability to communicate effectively. But the one place we constantly communicate but rarely ever think about is at the molecular level inside our cells. Our bodies rely upon microscopic relays to carry out just about every function you can think of. When these communications are disrupted, the body no longer functions efficiently. In my dissertation, I studied the interaction and integration of two cellular signals, BMP, or bone morphogenetic protein, and insulin. BMP is a key signal usually associated with early growth and development. On the other hand, insulin is a signal usually associated with maintenance of the body, mainly in regulating blood glucose levels in humans, liver function, and fat utilization, and is commonly associated with type 2 diabetes. Using the simple roundworm C. elegans, pictured there, I identified a line of communication that integrated the two signals from the skin to the intestine. C. elegans are an incredible model organism for genetics because many signaling pathways, such as BMP and insulin, are evolutionarily conserved from humans, or from C. elegans to humans. To identify the communication between BMP and insulin, I utilized genetic analyses to examine the relationship between different components of the signaling pathways. We analyzed genes first by disrupting the function of the gene in question and then observing the outcome in the system. We can additionally deduce relationships between genes by disrupting pairs and interpreting the outcomes. For my thesis, I focused on genes in the BMP pathway alongside insulin. First, I found that disrupting the BMP pathway in the skin directly altered fat stores in the intestine. Second, I found that when I reduced the amount of BMP signaling, the levels of insulin were increased in the skin. These changes in insulin would then be interpreted by the intestine to regulate fat stores. Lastly, I showed that this line of communication between BMP and insulin may expand beyond fat storage to also regulate other homeostatic functions such as cellular recycling and lifespan. Together, these findings uncover additional groundwork for understanding the communication between two cellular signals. But why do we care? I'm sure many in the audience have never heard of bone morphogenetic protein before or ever seen a C. elegans, but I'm sure many of you would probably be familiar with insulin. The regulation of insulin plays a very large role in type 2 diabetes, as the body can no longer respond properly to insulin signals in response to blood sugar levels. With more than 3 million cases of diabetes in the US alone, it is just one of many metabolic disorders that continue to be an ever-growing concern in modern society. While diet and sedentary lifestyles have taken the brunt of public blame, many of these disorders boil down to malfunctions in cellular signaling. It is my hope that by understanding the role that BMP plays in the regulation of insulin, we can provide a greater understanding of these complex networks and provide new avenues for therapeutics. Sometimes, the best answers come from sitting down and listening to what our cells are saying and how they're saying it. Thank you.
Good evening. It's complicated. No, I'm not talking about the film or about a relationship status. I'm talking about state funding for higher education. In his article, State Funding, A Race to the Bottom, Pell Institute's Thomas Mortensen warned, quote, based on trends since 1980, average state fiscal support for higher education will reach 0 by 2059, end quote. Many scholars and journalists have written about this decline. Far less has been written about the impacts this erosion is having on our public colleges and university systems. This led me to develop 4 case studies. Using data from the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, known as IPEDS, my case studies examine the impacts of changes in state funding for operating costs, specifically the impacts on access and success for the 20-year period between 1990 and 2010. As you might guess, I found that core revenue in all 4 systems shifted away from state appropriations and towards tuition. Let me highlight findings from 2 of the systems, Georgia and New York. First, I should point out that Georgia is the only one of the 4 systems with a state-mandated funding formula. Its formula sets tuition and fees at 1/4 of the total instructional and support costs. In 1990, USG's core revenue reflected that percentage. However, by 2010, as state appropriations dropped 26 percentage points, tuition revenue represented not 1/4, but 1/3 of the core revenue. Turning to CUNY, state appropriations also had a significant decline. But unlike the other 3 systems, its tuition revenue also declined by a full percentage point. It was possible only because CUNY's other revenue sources, which included a significant uptick in philanthropy, grew 30%. In terms of the impact on students, it was big. Over the 20-year period, state support per student decreased nearly 40% at all 4 systems. On a high note, all 4 systems had significant increases in state financial aid awards. But this is a double-edged sword. On the positive side, providing funding directly to students in need allowed them to stay in school and complete their degrees. However, this hinders the university's ability to properly plan for new and existing programs. It forces the institutions to depend on high enrollment of low-income students to meet budgetary shortfalls. Furthermore, low-income students often need additional support that comes with additional costs. Counterintuitively, despite these losses, there were overall increases in enrollment and in the number of degrees awarded per capita in nearly all of the 47 institutions in my study. Happily, these are some of the best colleges in the country at raising students from the bottom to the top income quartile. Why are these colleges successful despite state funding decreases? The answer is found in a 1997 newspaper editorial. Quote, "Parents and students pay the ever-increasing tuitions because they fear the alternative, dropping out. With the wage gap widening, colleges can keep boosting tuitions, knowing that young people will beg or borrow rather than boycott and risk getting off track to a comfortable future," end quote. The case studies in my dissertation provide arguments that strongly support a return to greater support for higher education.
Good evening. Most of us in this room have seen a commercial for a genetic ancestry test. Some of us may have even taken one out of curiosity. Over the last 10 years, the industry has ballooned to cater to individual needs. Whether you need a test to tell you your specific African ancestry, or a test that can tell you your medical history and your ancestry, there's a product on the market for you. After taking a genetic ancestry test in 2011 and witnessing this industry's growth, I questioned the significance of this test to my own sense of self. Does this change how I understand my history and my racial ethnic identity? How are other people interpreting this information? How can nations and other political projects use this technology to heal or potentially continue to surveil communities? Each of these questions guided my dissertation as I worked with a group of Black American adults enrolled in an arts and education program. I worked closely with this community to understand their racial identity development and their personal histories. Traditionally, racial identity literature centers how negative experiences inform identity development. It also views identity as fixed after the age of 25. However, through my dissertation, I complicate this understanding. Key findings indicate that positive events, such as the integration of the genetic ancestry results and the experience within the program itself, affected participants' understandings of their identities. Additionally, identity refinement amongst this group continued past the traditional cutoff of early adulthood, allowing for multiple influences to inform identity formation. This process, which I'm terming racial becoming, creates a more dynamic perspective within racial identity literature. While this community spoke mostly about their hopes and their newfound confidence, doubts also lingered. These doubts often centered how and if genetic data could be used after ancestry sequencing. As these questions arose, stories about genetic testing flooded the news. Genetic ancestry tests specifically were used to help solve several cold cases in California, including the infamous case of the Golden State Killer. These stories put genetic surveillance into the mainstream and raised concerns in the public dialogue about the ethics of using this technology in this particular way. Despite these concerns, the industry continues to grow. The most popular testing company is currently valued at about $2 billion.
As these tensions between solving questions of ancestral roots and potential genetic surveillance expand, individuals continue to create and seek meaning from their results. While this group only represents a fraction of the millions who have taken ancestry tests, my project creates a new avenues, for racial identity scholars to explore identity processes. Whether we are considering ancestry tests or experiences within college classrooms, racial identity literature has the potential to be more dynamic in its scope. Thank you.
Today, activists, city officials, and scholars are exploring the histories and possible futures of American policing. The connections between the ever-growing power of the American military and domestic police departments often features in these conversations, but with a particular focus on what is, for a historian, very recent history. When crafting my dissertation topic, I wanted to consider the impact of a pre-9/11 military mobilization on municipal policing in the service of providing for a more robust understanding of the relationships between these branches of state power. I focused on World War II because it was a mass mobilization of the American people and the American state in an understudied moment in histories of policing and incarceration. My project looks at New York City because of its role as a leader in municipal policing during these years, and relies on archival research in the New York City Municipal Archives collections of the papers of the mayor and health commissioner, the records of federal wartime agencies housed at the National Archives at College Park, and records pertaining to the New York City Police Department held at John Jay College Archives, among other collections. My scholarship operates at the intersections of gender history, urban history, and carceral studies. I consider how, during the war, young women were arrested for juvenile delinquency when found walking through Times Square with sailors. Black women were targeted as prostitutes and venereal disease carriers, and interracial dance halls and burlesque venues were shuttered, all in the name of national security. World War II is often considered a moment of advancement and opportunities for African American men and women, and for women of all races. Though this was true in some ways, the war also enabled the constriction of civil rights, most extremely in the internment of Japanese Americans. In the expanded power of the NYPD on the streets of wartime New York City, we can see another, less well-known manifestation of this dynamic. In my dissertation, titled A War Within a War, Policing Gender and Race in New York City During World War II, I argue that during the war, the leaders of the New York City Police Department and the administration of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia presented anti-vice or morality policing as an essential component of national security. The mayor and the police commissioner argued that prostitution, juvenile delinquency, gambling, and the venues that housed these activities threatened enlisted men and the wartime order of the city. Though the mayor and commissioner had sought to restrict these activities before the war, the mobilization created a new opportunity and context in which these campaigns proved far more successful than their pre-war predecessors. Officials constructed these threats relying on gendered ideas about the responsibilities of citizenship in the nation at war, and racist anxieties about increasing African American, Afro-Caribbean, and Puerto Rican migration into New York City. The women and people of color whose lives these policies disrupted mobilized resistance to the NYPD during the war. Women in Harlem criticized police practices that they felt labeled Black women as prostitutes in interviews with left-wing African American newspapers, and boycotted other papers that they felt disseminated these stereotypes. Parents complained in letters to Mayor LaGuardia of the treatment their children received at the hands of NYPD officers. In many of these instances of resistance, New Yorkers connected their criticism to the ongoing war being fought in the name of democracy and freedom. When faced with police repression, they asked, in the words of one Long Island father, "Is this the freedom we are all working so hard for?" These protests did not fall on sympathetic ears. The city's leadership prioritized maintaining urban order and protecting the health and security of enlisted men, particularly white enlisted men, over respecting civil, social, and sexual liberties of New Yorkers. By looking at policing during the war years, my dissertation adds a new perspective on what going to war meant for urban residents and illustrates the ways criminality interacted with constructions of gender and race particular to this historical moment. Thank you.
As you know, there are many differences between healthy cells and disease cells, including cancer cells. However, traditional chemotherapeutic drugs cannot distinguish the difference between the healthy cells and the cancer cells. So while it does a great job of eliminating the cancer cells, it can cause severe damage in the healthy organs and tissues, which can cause debilitating side effects in patients. To improve this lack of selectivity in drugs, scientists have applied nanotechnology to create a tiny capsule-like container that can be used to encapsulate the drugs, which now have the propensity to accumulate more in the tumor sites than the non-tumor sites. Going a step forward, for my dissertation, I investigated development of smart, shape-changing nanomaterials that can potentially accumulate more in tumor tissues and is smart enough to distinguish the difference between the healthy cells and the cancer cells. You see, there's an enzyme called matrix metalloproteinase, and it is responsible for breaking down the connective tissues in your body, and it's very important in functions like wound healing and regular turnover of cells. However, in cancer cells, these enzymes are overexpressed and activated 80 times more than in comparison to healthy cells. And many pharmaceutical companies have tried to make drugs that can inhibit this enzyme, but have failed. So rather than inhibiting this enzyme, I have designed nanomaterials that are made of peptides and can be recognized by these enzymes and change its shape when the enzyme engages with the nanomaterial. So here is a transmission electron microscope picture of a worm-like peptide nanomaterial and a spherical peptide nanocarrier. So when these peptide nanomaterials are engaged by this here is a confocal image of a breast cancer cell that overexpresses these enzymes, it will change its shape into either these therapeutic fibers, which can act synergistically with the drugs that you've delivered, or because they are made of peptides, they can disintegrate into these amino acids, which your body can metabolize and use as nutrients. So for my dissertation, I made 12 systematically different peptide nanomaterials with different shapes, sizes, and charges, and came up with design rules to understand how to effectively engage with these enzymes so you can control the rate in which these shapes change and also what the peptides end up looking like afterwards. So while this work is far from curing cancer, I hope that the design rules that I established during my dissertation can serve as a guideline for researchers who are making these smart nanomaterials and one day improve the quality of life for patients undergoing chemotherapy. Thank you.
You're looking at a typical theatrical rehearsal studio that is one of many scattered around Midtown Manhattan where Broadway musicals hold auditions. You might assume that this is the room where stars get discovered or a chorus dancer lands a big break. But it's also the room where actors are told things like, "We're not looking for heavy character actresses," or "You're not fat enough to be our fat girl," or "Dance like a man, butch it up." And it's also the room you might not even have access to because you are deaf or hard of hearing, or you use a wheelchair to get around, and the casting notice did not specify that you were welcome to attend. You've probably heard of or thought about casting mostly when it pertains to issues around race and ethnicity, which tend to get the most attention from both scholars and the press. My research reframes the study of casting to focus on bodies, always inclusive of race and ethnicity, but specifically centered on questions of ability, gender, sexuality, and size. Musicals make meaning through their performance of difference. Which identities are represented on stage and how reveals which are valued. Embodied differences are profoundly tied to an actor's employability. When an actor enters that room, they put their body on the line. Do they have a Broadway body or not? Casting necessarily depends upon disqualifying people, often based upon their appearance. During my own career as a dancer, my height was often the barrier to getting hired. The politics of casting gripped me because they are complicit in enforcing a system of bodily norms shaping how we all perceive difference. Musicals gripped me because song and dance complicate the performance of identity even as they proclaim it in anthems like "I am what I am" or "I am changing." Broadway's relationship to non-normative bodies has been and remains at best ambivalent. Consider that the only contemporary Broadway musicals with fat female characters as romantic leads are Dreamgirls and Hairspray, and that both of these productions used fat suits for the actors cast in those leading roles. Only 2 Broadway musicals have cast deaf and hard of hearing actors, revivals of Big River and Spring Awakening, both from Los Angeles' Deaf West Theater. And Ally Stroker remains the Broadway musical's only performer who uses a wheelchair for mobility. Broadway's history of casting straight men as gay characters and subsequently applauding their bravery exemplifies the industry's ultimate ambivalence towards identity. The Broadway musical's appearance of inclusivity is ultimately just a performance designed to sell tickets. The aesthetics of disqualification used in casting reenact those of US society at large. The identities that I study and the social movements formed around them are forged upon histories of stigmatization and exclusion that extend far beyond the stage. The way all of our bodies look and act plays a part in determining how we are employed off stage as well, which is seen in persistent employment and pay gaps for women, people of color, the deaf, people with disabilities, fat people, and for LGBTQ communities. In focusing on casting as a labor practice and a site of power relations, my research asks you to consider whose bodies are cast and whose are cast aside. Thank you.
Good evening. Guilty by association was the joining of multiple versions of myself. It was a deeply personal, intellectually challenging, and professionally inspiring piece of work. I found my research topic by reflecting on my personal experiences, my pain and my joy, my triumphs and my failures. My father was incarcerated for 20 years during my life, a period that spanned from my early childhood until my early 30s. Throughout my life, I sought to minimize the situation. His incarceration was not going to be the story of my life. However, as I grew older and learned more about the world and myself, the questions I never dared to ask before rose to the surface, and I needed to know more about myself and my community, children of incarcerated parents. Common perception is that as a child of an incarcerated parent, I was more likely to be in prison than standing here tonight, so it is a great honor for me to be on this stage to push back against that narrative in person. Once deemed an invisible population, the amount of attention children of incarcerated parents are receiving is growing, but it's still inadequate. Public perception is often shaped by research that paints these children as vulnerable souls from broken homes who are more likely to have a criminal record than a college degree. Pandering to white fear about Black and brown criminality by framing children of incarcerated parents as a future threat to public safety, much of the previous research, even when well-intentioned, has tarnished our image by hyper-focusing on adverse effects and retelling our narratives without our input. My research sought to challenge these narratives by addressing 2 questions. 1, what strategies do children of incarcerated parents use to protect and maintain their identities by being tainted by the stigma that surrounds incarceration? And 2, how are the experiences of these children similar and different from their peers who are not directly impacted? After conducting field work with community groups and conducting preliminary ethnographic work, my dissertation focuses on 9 extensive case studies with New York City youth between the ages of 12 and 17. Much like me, parental incarceration was not their whole story. Often we are told that children of incarcerated parents are ashamed of their parent because they're in prison. However, what I found is that we are not ashamed of our parents, but instead, we are ashamed of a society that chooses to ostracize, label, and define us based on circumstances beyond our control. I also found that children of incarcerated parents are representative of something I like to call the unique universal. In many ways, children of incarcerated parents are like other children. They're concerned with friendships, drama at school, social media, plans for the future, and the other things that occupy the minds of youth. However, their unique life experiences have shaped them in definitive ways. For example, like many children from poorer working-class families, they are used to handling more responsibilities in the household. However, unique to them is the ability, strength, and resilience to live day-to-day life without the sympathy and support that other children who have an absent parent receive. By valuing lived expertise and acknowledging the competency of our youth, my research pushes back against traditional deficit-based depictions of children of incarcerated parents, which often enthusiastically point out what's wrong without ever asking what's right. By highlighting the good, it is my hope that my research becomes a small part of the necessary but lofty goal of the destruction of mass incarceration and the reframing of directly impacted individuals. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Julia Wrigley, Interim Provost. And I want to say, I'm sure that everyone in this room knows what a long haul it is to finish a dissertation. But our political science colleagues still had the power to astound us. And thank you for that eye-opening experience ending so triumphantly. I think when people start a doctoral program and they have to take all those classes, they have to take the qualifying exams, they have to write a proposal, they have to advance through all the many steps the program provides for them. But then when they enter upon the dissertation, that makes all the rest of it look easy, because the dissertation is intrinsically very difficult. It's where you become a true researcher yourself, and where you have to make all the decisions, with the help, one hopes, of your advisor, but how you'll develop a topic which engages you, which you will still like a year later, a topic which you can research, a topic where you can organize your thoughts, where you can write it up in a compelling way, where you can interest others in your topic. These are all extremely challenging things. But I think also doing the dissertation is the most gratifying part of doing a PhD, because it's when you get to develop yourself as a true member of an intellectual community who has brought new ideas to bear, new insights, new thoughts. And I think this evening what we saw is how delightful it is to hear about those ideas when they're presented by people who still have the enthusiasm of discovery, who are highly creative, and who, I have to say, are all very skilled speakers. And you did, in fact, stay within your 3 minutes. So I want to commend you all and to say that as we walk around this building, of course, we know the students in our own programs, but it's nice to think about all those other students who we don't know, perhaps, but we think about the ideas they're carrying within them, the work they're doing, and the stamina they're exhibiting in getting their dissertations done. So we want to congratulate you. We'd also like now to invite you to come to a reception just across the way in the James Gallery. Thank you.